Good afternoon and welcome to today's press conference. My name is Mia Rabson and I'm a reporter with the Canadian Press and I will be moderating today's event. We have with us today, I believe, Senator Marty Deacon and Senator Brent Cotter, who are going to speak, and then if they have time for some questions, we'll open it up to the floor after that. If you are online, please use the raise hand function. Go ahead.
Today for being here and for you folks and joining us today. Really appreciate it, being here in person and certainly being here virtually. In 2021, the Parliament passed Bill C-2118, which legalized single sports betting across the country. I voted for this legislation. I saw that illegal single sports betting was happening anyway, whether in the gray market or overseas, and I thought better to legalize it so that Canadians could bet with Canadian companies following Canadian laws and standards. What we did not foresee, however, was the torrent of advertising and promotion that Canadians of all ages would be subject to on a daily basis. I have heard from no shortage of individuals bemoaning the ads they are seeing on television, especially when they sit down to watch sports. This year's NHL playoffs served as a strong reminder that the promotion of sports betting in this country is getting out of hand, and Canadians are getting tired of the advertising they are seeing. One poll saying that 63% of us want to see less. A recent CBC story found that the average Canadian was subjected to nearly 9 minutes of betting ads if they sat down to watch a playoff game. This doesn't even consider the advertising they are seeing within segments as well, or in their favorite sports shows. The reality is you cannot sit down in this country to enjoy a sport without being exposed to a barrage of such advertising. These ads, though, are much more than just annoying, and they can lead to addictions and other harms through gambling problems. Children and vulnerable groups in particular respond to these ads, and many can find themselves in trouble down the road once they become addicted. A 2022 Stat Canada reported that 2/3 of Canadians aged 15 or older reported gambling in the past year. While only 1.6% of these individuals were at a moderate to severe risk of problems related to gambling, that is still over 300,000 Canadians who are at risk. We need to keep in mind as well that these statistics were done from the first year of single sports betting and when it was legalized in the country. Many had yet to be bombarded with the advertising they are being exposed to today. This is particularly concerning for our young Canadians. A substantial amount of research has shown that it is children and young adults who respond most positively to the constant stream of ads being run. The betting industry will tell you they are doing all they can not to promote to children, but the research has clearly shown that when sport idols like Connor McDavid, Austin Matthews are encouraging them to gamble, they will want to gamble also. It becomes part of the game for them, and they want to emulate what they see. You don't need to take my word for this, though. We need only to look overseas to see other countries who are clamping down on the kinds of advertising we are letting run unrestricted here at home. In 2007, the UK legalized single sport betting, and like us, did very little to restrict promotion. Today, as a result, it's estimated that 1/3 people in the UK are problem gamblers. 55,000 of these individuals are children. For each problem gambler, 6 other people suffer harm, such as the breakup of families, crime, loss of employment, and loss of homes. Tragically, on average, a problem gambler commits suicide every day in the UK. Recognizing this, and thanks in large part to a report done by the House of Lords, which I just quoted from, the UK is beginning to correct this. Last year, they banned celebrities and athletes from appearing in gambling ads. Gambling ads will not air until 9 p.m. and no longer will they see gambling promotions adorning the jersey of their favorite footballer. These steps are not limited to the UK, however. Italy, Spain, Poland, Belgium, and the Netherlands have all recently introduced strict regulations on gambling advertising, some banning ads entirely. So, we're here today. That is why today I will be tabling legislation to get ahead of these problems before they start and/or continue. I think it would be foolish to wait and see if these same problems arise in Canada and then react to them only when so many lives have been ruined by problem gambling as a result. This is a busy time in the Senate and in the House, but never too busy to act on health and other related risks associated with gambling. Let me be clear. This legislation tasks the government with placing reasonable limits on sports betting advertising to protect society and particularly our children and youth. Specifically, it would compel the government to work with provinces and other stakeholders to, number one, identify measures to regulate the advertising of game sports betting in Canada, such as limiting or banning the participation of celebrities and athletes, restricting the use of non-broadcast advertising, or by limiting the number, scope, or location of such advertisements. Number two, identify measures to promote research and intergovernmental information sharing in relation to the prevention and diagnosis of minors involved in problematic gambling activities and support measures for those who are impacted by it. Three, set out national standards for the prevention and diagnosis of problematic gambling and addiction and for support measures for those who are impacted by this. It would also task the CRTC with reviewing its regulations and policies to assess their adequacy and effectiveness in reducing the incidence of harms resulting from the proliferation of advertising and sport event betting. For many groups and advocates, this legislation might fall a little short. Over the past months, I have tracked match manipulation globally and the rise of online gambling. In addition, Dr. Bruce Kidd, who very recently launched banadsforgambling.ca, also initially reached out to me to ask if anything could be done legislatively to address what we are seeing. After a great deal of research done by our drafters and a lot of legal and constitutional assistance from my colleague right beside me here on my left, we realized that an outright ban would be hard to do, if not impossible to stage in a Senate public bill. You'll recall the legal battles over the course of nearly 2 decades to get to the restrictions that we have on tobacco. What we have here instead is an opportunity to address these problems before they get really rolling and much, much worse. I would expect the government to consult and work with industry as well to get the reasonable, logical, and sustainable way to advertise to Canadians without creating addicts and child gamblers. Nor is the government confined to guidelines suggested in the bill. If they want to go further, I would encourage them to do so. The Centre for Addiction and Mental Health very recently proposed a whistle-to-whistle ban, which would prevent all commercial messages and betting-related editorial content from appearing on air beginning 5 minutes before a game and 5 minutes after the game. I'm sure a number of you are thinking about how this would affect the recent proposals by the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, the AGCO. This is around banning celebrities and athletes from such ads. I don't believe this would have a negative effect at all. On the contrary, I believe this gives Canada a once-in-a-generation opportunity to regulate such advertising across the country. On this last point as well, though this advertising is flooding airways nationally, it is still only Ontario that has opened up this market to private companies. This is not a widely known fact, and it has led to some confusing state of affairs for many across this country. The truth of the matter is we do have national advertising standards on tobacco, alcohol, and cannabis. So it makes little sense to me that sports betting would be exempt from this. I also think it would be in the interest of the industry to have one set of rules to abide by nationally, rather than a patchwork of provincial guidelines as provincial regulations evolve on a province-to-province basis. With all of this in mind, I would like to now turn to my colleague, Senator Cotter, who would like to say a few words on this today? Senator?
Thank you, Senator Deacon. I'll be brief. I endorse all of the observations that were made by Senator Deacon in her remarks. I was also a supporter of the single event sports betting legislation of 2 years ago, thinking that it seemed to be an activity that ought not to be criminalized, which it had been previously. I think it's fair to say that we anticipated a degree of advertising to put in place the betting platforms and the customers who might use them to bet, but not very many of us expected the explosion of advertising to promote not just joining a betting platform, but also placing bets relentlessly. I saw an ad a few weeks ago. It turned out to be a spoof of an apology from a sports television channel in which the message of apology was to have apologized for interrupting a sports betting ad to return to the live hockey game. It seemed to me to be a interesting way of making the point that we are seeing way too much. Unpleasant isn't, though, the main issue here. It's vulnerability. It's also a national issue, I think, as Senator Deacon identified, which requires partnership between federal and provincial regulatory agencies. We don't have all of the answers. Senator Deacon outlined a series of approaches that are taken in other countries that represent possibilities, but we think professionals who understand both the business side of this equation, the constitutional side in terms of what kinds of limits can be placed on commercial speech, can fashion a model of restraint with respect to advertising that doesn't undercut the industry, but also protects our most vulnerable people. I'll stop there and welcome your questions, but I would just say at the end that this approach in the legislation endorses that philosophy of a strategy that will work beyond simply a single regulation, and it is for the people who do this work on a regular basis in the public interest to launch that work, and this bill is intended to inspire, motivate, and require them to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll start with questions. Davis Legree from iPolitics.
Yeah, hi. Senator Deacon, I've talked to many family friends who are sports fans, and it seems like everyone is fed up with this. Why do you think this is a topic that so many people are passionate about?
Thank you, and thank you for your question. Very passionate because, first of all, I think there's been what we call a quick shift. So typically anything that changes, anything that becomes amplified and modified will garner attention. And we see it for some folks who are very passionate about because it's connected to what they see as some celebrities that they don't see and hear from. They also get quite passionate because a lot of folks are watching sports in group settings, and they can get really sucked into some peer activity that's a short-term adrenaline flow. And so it becomes that piece in a social sense, in a research and caring about Canadian sense. It's one more thing that is impacting the health of Canadians, particularly young Canadians, but we have enough. And so anything else that's triggering or that is encouraging poor mental health, it's an interest of many.
David, could I just add one observation to that? I think a lot of people are becoming frustrated that it reshapes the event away from the sports event itself, which many of us embrace as a good thing, and the event becomes betting on the event. And so people are, in some respects, distracted from the event because they're busy thinking about how have the odds shifted about whether this team or that will win based on the situation. And people can make their own choices about how they enjoy sporting events, but it has detracted from the kind of core and culture of what we have generally embraced with respect to sports. And people who may not be worried about, gee whiz, I don't want my kids watching this because they might start gambling, are offended that that shift away from something that they really value to something they don't value at all or value very much less is happening by virtue of this. Thanks.
If I could, too, if you don't mind, I answered your question sort of based on a community piece. From a personal point, there is no more anyone, I think, more passionate about what the values of sport can be and what the power of sport can be in small rooms, in communities, in countries, and in our international Olympic movement. So there's a violation. It feels like a violation and a dishonor of what the capacity in sport can do in building better communities. And I think that's another sort of pull on this one.
Whenever I'm in those small rooms, we have conversations, and after that initial kind of, when it first came out, all those ads, and Canadians kind of got hit over the head with the amount of ads. The expectation was that the market would kind of naturally saturate, and that would kind of inherently correct itself over time. Why should that not be the expectation anymore, and why is legislation necessary?
Well, I don't think, David, that saturation and settling down has actually occurred. My impression of the sports advertising, I watch sports on television, I'm not an expert, I don't watch every sport and every ad, but my sense along these lines is that and this is what I anticipated, which would be there'd be an initiative by a number of the betting platforms to attract clientele who would then bet through that platform regularly. And I wasn't surprised that lots of them right out of the gate, particularly in Ontario, were trying to attract customers. The pattern now feels to me to be not just join our platform, but bet and bet again and bet again. And you know, the shift in promotion has been not so much away from joining the betting world, but spend your money. And I think that actually, combined with its relentlessness, is also a part of the risk factor now.
I have a question from this chair over here. I'm just curious if what consultation you've done with the government or other senators to see what kind of support there is either within the government or within the Senate to get this bill through.
Thank you, and thank you for your question. So I mentioned in my my comments earlier that we were hearing, first of all, from I would call stakeholders in the community. So there was a growing concern of interest across, I would call it the sport, the health, the mental health circles, a variety of those coming together to really voice and share their concerns. When I speak to a parliamentarian, when I speak to a House member or a senator member, the first thing I get is, oh, it is out of control. What are we going to do about this? This is an unintended consequence beyond our wildest dreams in a short period of time. Who's going to take this on? And so that has been a fairly consistent set of comments, some really good questions, you know, why now, what do we know globally about it, and we've opened up many conversations in responding to those questions.
Could I just add that I think in some ways this work and the bill that Senator Deacon is presenting today is richly democratic in the sense that it is primarily from the ground up, from the communities of interest, individuals, groups that we are hearing from. We haven't, you know, gone over and had a coffee with the Minister of Sport or Minister of Heritage and say, what do you think should happen here? What are you hearing? This is really coming from community interests. And, you know, in the small circles in which each of us senators travels, this conversation arises incessantly and with the message, what are you going to do about it? I get emails from people who are wonderful friends of mine who might talk about the richest of all possible things, but they are bombarding me with emails about do something about this ridiculous dimension. They're not against the concept of betting. They're opposed to the relentlessness and lack of control of the relentless advertising, I think.
If I could add to that just really quickly, if you don't mind, and definitely not to contradict my colleague, but some of the conversations in the what I would call a sport ethics and sport law circles. I have had the opportunity to listen to over 100 folks connected to national sport organizations. What are their issues right now in safe sport? And there were three. One was concussions and still is. One is very much, as you know, in the House, the safe sport and abuse. And the third one is this. And so there is a real garnered interest across and within the sports circles. But CAMH has also been very progressive in reaching out and having some conversations with us so we understand it beyond what we might perceive the sport boundaries.
I think what I was trying to get at is what confidence do you have that this bill will actually get support to be passed in the Senate, or alternatively, that the government might take it up, given that it's more likely to pass in a short order if the government takes it on?
Yes, and to clarify, the government can do whatever they like on whatever day they wish with this, and that's very, very possible that they may take this bill and run with it. But I feel that right now, as a Canadian, and looking at the health, that momentum from all corners is moving to get something done to rein this in somehow as urgently as possible.
We don't have a lot of ego invested in this, so if the executive of government phoned us up tomorrow and said, you know, we have a slightly better bill that we would like to replace it, you've been the catalyst for getting this going, I would, and that actually delivered on the product, I would be as happy as can be and wouldn't have to do any more of these conversations.
But those conversations haven't happened yet, is what I'm trying, like, you haven't sat down, you said you haven't met with the Minister of Sport to see if there would be that kind
Not
of...
in any kind of specific way. The conversations have been largely informal, and you know, there are lots of challenges in the world of safe sport. This is one of them. We're trying to raise the profile of it through this bill and produce a result. And the fact of the matter is that the government can do more than one thing at a time, so we'd like to see them work on this as well as the other fronts that are so important to Canadians.
And perhaps this one's best for Senator Cotter, but I'm admittedly not super familiar with this issue, but it seems to me that like the line has been drawn. You know, there's many commercials for beer, and you can't advertise for tobacco or cigarettes. And can you walk me through the legal challenges preventing an outright ban on gambling ads?
Just a kind of a snapshot of that. There is a freedom of expression in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It applies in a more limited way to what would be called commercial expression, which is often thought of as advertising. And therefore, with respect to that as a constitutional right, a government putting in place a constraint or prohibition of that communication of expression has to justify it under Section 1 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So that requires it to be proportionate to the problem, no more interfering than necessary, and has to be connected to the objective. And in our context, we're talking about the vulnerability of young people and people who might be addicted to gaming. So you need to build a framework that meets that requirement of what's called reasonable limits prescribed by law in a free and democratic society, because this does amount to a certain degree of, would amount once put in place through some regulatory arrangement, would put in place constraints on, and maybe significant constraints on, people's freedom of expression. And the Government of Canada, under the Charter of Rights, has to then justify it, as a province would do in areas where it might take on a similar approach. So that's the framework. The Supreme Court has talked about this in terms of longstanding court cases on what does constitute expression and freedom of expression and what limits are justified. You need to apply it then to the specifics of this particular situation, and you know, we are offering this perspective, but we know that there are wise thinkers inside governments who understand the exact detail of what's manageable and what not, and what makes sense from a business point of view, and we think wise structure of restraint can be developed here. I hope that's helpful.
It's a high, in sort of thinking, it's a very high bar that has to be attained, as defined through so many cases, to really ban advertising on something completely. And you will, when you do, as you talk to Senator Cotter, the history of tobacco is a great learning. And the years and years and years of moving it through into the Supreme Court ruling and all different pieces. When I look at this and the work that we need to do, I look at it and go, you know, gambling advertising reaches a pretty high threshold, and the capacity and the evidence we're learning, it reaches a pretty high threshold. And I believe it meets the guardrails or the threshold that alcohol advertising would be considered. And so here we are. Let's make sure the government has legislation that passes this.
Thank you so much. That'll conclude today's press conference.
Thank you.